My father used to say that dignity is something no one can take from you unless you hand it over. He said this while working double shifts at a warehouse in Baltimore, coming home with his back aching and his pride intact. I believed him. I built my entire life around that belief. But on the morning of September 15th, standing in the executive conference room of Whitmore Financial Group, I learned that some people will try to rip your dignity away with their bare hands, smiling while they do it. My name is James Carter. I am 32 years old. I graduated summa cum laude from Howard University with a degree in forensic accounting. I earned my CPA before I turned 25. I have worked at Whitmore Financial for 4 years, and in that time, I have uncovered more fraudulent transactions than anyone in the compliance department. None of that mattered on September 15th. What mattered was the color of my skin and the assumptions that came with it. The meeting was supposed to be routine. Quarterly review of internal audit findings. I had prepared a 40-page report documenting irregularities in the Henderson account, a major client whose numbers had not added up for 3 consecutive quarters. I had cross-referenced wire transfers, identified shell companies, and traced funds to offshore accounts in the Caymans. It was meticulous work. It was important work, and I was proud of it. Richard Whitmore III, the senior vice president of operations and grandson of the company founder, sat at the head of the table. He was 43 years old with thinning blonde hair and the kind of permanent tan that comes from yacht trips and golf courses. He had never liked me. From my first day at the company, he made that clear in small ways. The way he looked past me in meetings. The way he mispronounced my last name despite being corrected dozens of times. The way he assigned me to the smallest office on the floor next to the supply closet. But I had learned to navigate these waters. I kept my head down. I did exceptional work. I believed that excellence would eventually speak louder than prejudice. That morning I discovered how naive that belief was. I stood to present my findings. I had barely finished my opening sentence when Richard interrupted me. His voice was loud, dismissive, and carried a sharp edge of contempt. He said my report was alarmist. He said I was seeing problems where none existed. He said, and I remember his exact words because they burned themselves into my memory, that perhaps I lacked the sophistication to understand complex financial instruments. The room fell silent. 11 white faces stared at me. No one spoke. No one defended me. I felt the familiar heat of humiliation rising in my chest, but I kept my composure. I tried to continue my presentation. Richard interrupted again. He accused me of having a personal vendetta against the Henderson account. He suggested that I was trying to create problems to make myself seem important. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said that people like me always had a chip on their shoulders. He said it casually as if it were simply an observation about the weather. People like me. The words hung in the air, poisonous and undeniable. I looked around the room, searching for an ally. I found none. Oliver Bennett, the chief financial officer, studied his fingernails. Thomas Mitchell, the head of legal, shuffled papers. Sarah Chen, the only other person of color in the room, kept her eyes fixed on the table. I was alone. Richard demanded that I sit down. He said my report would be reviewed by someone more qualified, someone who understood the nuances of high-net-worth client management. He smiled as he said it, that thin smile that carried no warmth. I sat down. What else could I do? In that moment, fighting back would have meant losing everything. I had bills to pay, a mother whose medical treatments were not cheap, a younger sister whose college tuition depended on my income. I sat down, and I felt a piece of myself crack. After the meeting, I returned to my small office and closed the door. I sat in the dark for a long time, trying to process what had happened. I had been publicly humiliated. My work had been dismissed. My character had been attacked, and no one had said a word in my defense. I thought about quitting. I thought about filing a complaint with HR, but I knew how those stories ended. I had seen other black employees try to fight the system, only to be quietly pushed out, their careers destroyed, their reputations tarnished. I was still sitting in the dark when someone knocked on my door. I assumed it was Thomas from legal, coming to tell me that my services were no longer required. I prepared myself for the worst. But when I opened the door, I found someone I did not expect, someone who would change everything. Her name was Victoria Ashworth. She was the CEO of Whitmore Financial Group, the first woman to hold that position in the company's 90-year history. She had joined the company 5 years ago, brought in by the board to modernize operations after a series of scandals. She was 34 years old, with blonde hair that fell past her shoulders and blue eyes that seemed to see everything. I had seen her in meetings, always composed, always in control, always in. She rarely spoke to employees below the director level. I had never exchanged more than a few words with her. She stood in my doorway, her expression unreadable. She asked if she could come in. I was too surprised to do anything but nod. She entered my small office, looked around at the cramped space and frowned. Then she turned to me and said something I will never forget. She said she had watched the meeting through the glass partition in her adjacent office. She said she had seen everything. And she said she was sorry. I did not know how to respond. In 4 years at this company, no one in leadership had ever apologized to me for anything. Victoria sat down in the chair across from my desk. She asked to see my report on the Henderson account. I hesitated. Richard had made it clear that my analysis was unwelcome, but something in her eyes told me I could trust her. I handed her the 40 pages. She read in silence for nearly 20 minutes. I watched her face as she turned the pages, looking for any sign of her thoughts. When she finished, she looked up at me with an expression I could not identify. She said my work was exceptional. She said the irregularities I had found were serious and warranted immediate investigation. Then she said something that surprised me even more. She said Richard Whitmore had been protecting the Henderson account for years. She did not know why, but she intended to find out. Victoria stood to leave. At the door, she paused and turned back to me. She said I should continue my investigation, quietly and carefully. She said I should document everything, every transaction, every communication, every meeting. She said she would be watching. And she said that no matter what happened, I was not alone anymore. After she left, I sat in the silence of my small office, trying to understand what had just occurred. For the first time in 4 years, someone with power had seen me. Not as a threat, not as a problem, not as someone to be managed or dismissed, but as a professional whose work had value, as a human being whose dignity mattered. I did not know then where this path would lead. I did not know the depths of corruption I would uncover, or the dangers I would face, or the unexpected alliance that would form between Victoria and me. All I knew was that something had shifted. The crack in my soul began to heal, replaced by something harder and more determined. I would not be silenced again. I would not be shamed. I would find the truth, and I would make sure the world saw it. That night I went home to my apartment in Brooklyn and pulled out a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote 3 words. Document everything. Truth matters. It was the beginning of something I could not yet understand, but I was ready to fight. The weeks following my humiliation in the conference room became a masterclass in corporate survival. I learned to move through the hallways of Whitmore Financial like a ghost, present but invisible, watching everything while appearing to notice nothing. Richard Whitmore III had made me a target, and targets in this environment did not last long unless they learned to adapt. My investigation into the Henderson account began quietly, in the margins of my official duties. I arrived early each morning before the security cameras in the compliance department were monitored by live personnel. I stayed late each evening, accessing archived files that should have been routine, but contained patterns that told a darker story. I was careful, I was methodical, and I was patient. The Henderson account was a labyrinth. On the surface, it appeared to be a standard investment portfolio for a wealthy client named Gerald Henderson, a Texas oil executive with connections to half the politicians in Washington. But beneath that surface lay a web of shell companies, offshore transfers, and suspicious transactions that suggested something far more sinister. Money was moving through Henderson's accounts in ways that made no legitimate sense. Large sums would arrive from obscure foreign entities, sit briefly in the account, and then disappear into a maze of subsidiaries. It had all the hallmarks of money laundering. What troubled me most was Richard's involvement. As Senior Vice President of Operations, He should have had no direct role in managing client accounts. Yet his fingerprints were everywhere. Approval signatures on irregular transfers, emails authorizing exceptions to standard compliance protocols, meeting notes from private conversations with Henderson himself. Richard was not just protecting this account. He was actively participating in whatever scheme it concealed. I documented everything. Every transaction. Every email. Every exception. I created a shadow file on an encrypted drive I kept in my apartment, far from the company's servers. I knew that if Richard discovered what I was doing, I would be fired immediately. Worse, I would likely be framed for the very crimes I was uncovering. I had seen it happen before. A black employee at another firm had tried to expose corruption and found himself accused of embezzlement. He spent 2 years fighting criminal charges before they were finally dropped. His career never recovered. Victoria Ashworth became my unexpected ally in this dangerous work. Our meetings were infrequent and carefully concealed. She would send me calendar invitations for training sessions that did not exist, using them as cover for our conversations. We would meet in the small conference room on the 14th floor, the one with the broken security camera that maintenance never seemed to fix. She told me later that she had arranged for that camera to stay broken. In those meetings, Victoria revealed the pressures she faced as CEO. The board of directors was filled with Whitmore family loyalists, men who had known Richard's grandfather and felt a tribal obligation to protect the family name. They tolerated Victoria because she had delivered strong quarterly results, but their tolerance had limits. If she moved against Richard without overwhelming evidence, they would remove her and install someone more compliant. She needed proof that was irrefutable, proof that would leave the board no choice but to act. I provided that proof, piece by piece. Each week, I would bring new documents, new patterns, new connections. Victoria would study them with the same intensity she brought to everything, her blue eyes scanning pages while I explained the significance of each finding. She asked sharp questions. She challenged my assumptions. She made me refine my analysis until it was bulletproof. In those sessions, I saw a side of her that few employees ever witnessed. Behind the composed facade was a brilliant mind and a fierce determination to do what was right. The racist incidents did not stop during this period. If anything, they intensified. Richard seemed to sense that something was happening, even if he could not identify what. He became more aggressive in meetings, more dismissive of my contributions, more willing to humiliate me in front of colleagues. He assigned me to menial tasks beneath my qualifications. He excluded me from important projects. He spread rumors that I was difficult to work with, that I had attitude problems, that I was not a team player. The microaggressions multiplied. In the break room, a colleague named William Foster made a joke about my hair, asking if it conducted electricity. At a department lunch, Thomas Mitchell expressed surprise that I could afford to eat at an upscale restaurant, commenting that those places usually had dress codes. In a team meeting, Sarah Chen was praised for an analysis that used methodology I had developed and shared with her weeks earlier. No one acknowledged my contribution. When I pointed it out, Richard accused me of being territorial and suggested I needed to work on being more collaborative. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed individually, but together, they formed a pattern of systematic exclusion and disrespect. I was being pushed toward the door, one humiliation at a time. The message was clear. You do not belong here, and we will make your life miserable until you accept that truth and leave. But I did not leave. I could not. Not with the evidence I was gathering, not with the truth so close to being revealed, and not with Victoria fighting alongside me. Our relationship evolved during those weeks, though neither of us acknowledged it openly. What began as a strategic alliance became something more complex. I found myself looking forward to our meetings with an anticipation that went beyond professional collaboration. Victoria had a way of listening that made me feel truly heard. She remembered details from our previous conversations, small things I had mentioned about my family, my education, my dreams. She asked about my mother's health. She inquired about my sister's progress in school. She treated me not as an employee to be managed, but as a person whose life had meaning and depth. I began to notice things about her as well. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking deeply. The slight southern accent that emerged when she was frustrated. The vulnerability that flickered across her face when she spoke about the loneliness of leadership. Victoria Ashworth, the most powerful woman in the company, was also one of the most isolated. She had sacrificed personal connections to reach her position. She trusted almost no one. Yet somehow she had chosen to trust me. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, she asked me why I stayed. Why I endured the racism, the disrespect, the constant battle for dignity. I told her about my father, about his belief that excellence would eventually triumph over prejudice. I told her that I still believed in that principle, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. I told her that leaving would mean letting them win, letting them define what a black man could achieve in corporate America. I refused to give them that satisfaction. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that stayed with me. She said that she had spent her entire career being underestimated because of her gender. She said she understood, perhaps not completely, but she understood the weight of fighting battles that others could not see. And she said that watching me face those battles with such grace and determination had made her reconsider what true strength looked like. It was not dominance or aggression. It was persistence in the face of injustice. It was maintaining your humanity while others tried to strip it away. That night, I allowed myself to imagine a different future, one where the truth was revealed, where justice was served, where Victoria and I could know each other outside the shadows of our secret alliance. I pushed the thought away almost immediately. It was dangerous to dream of such things. There was too much work still to be done. The breakthrough came in the 7th week. I discovered a series of encrypted emails between Richard and Gerald Henderson, stored on a backup server that should have been purged years ago. Someone in IT had been careless. Or perhaps someone had wanted these emails to be found. Either way, the contents were explosive. Richard and Henderson were not just engaged in money laundering. They were funneling funds to shell companies connected to sanctioned foreign entities. We were talking about federal crimes, violations that could bring down the entire company. I brought the emails to Victoria. She read them 3 times, her face growing paler with each pass. When she finished, she looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, fear and determination mixed together. She said this was bigger than either of us had imagined. She said we needed to be extraordinarily careful about our next steps. And she said that the confrontation could wait no longer. Victoria scheduled an emergency board meeting for the following week. She did not tell me what she planned to say. She only told me to have every document ready, every piece of evidence organized and accessible. She told me to trust her. And despite everything I had learned about the dangers of trust, I did. The night before the board meeting, I sat in my apartment, reviewing the files one final time. My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. Everything I had worked for, everything I had endured came down to what would happen in that room. I thought about my father, about his faith in dignity and excellence. I hoped he would be proud. I hoped I was doing the right thing. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Financial was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, a constant reminder of the power concentrated in this space. The table could seat 30, though today only 14 chairs were occupied. 12 board members plus Richard Whitmore III and Victoria Ashworth faced each other across the polished mahogany surface. I was not supposed to be in that room. Junior employees never attended board meetings. But Victoria had arranged for my presence under the pretense of presenting routine compliance updates. Richard had objected, of course. He argued that such presentations were a waste of the board's time. But Victoria, as CEO, had the authority to set the agenda, and she had exercised that authority with a firmness that left no room for debate. I sat in a chair along the wall behind Victoria, holding a thick binder and a flash drive. My pulse was elevated, but my hands were steady. I had prepared for this moment for 2 months. I was ready. The meeting began with standard business: financial reports, strategic initiatives, market projections. Richard delivered a presentation on operational efficiencies, his voice smooth and confident. He made a point of ignoring my presence entirely, as if I were furniture. The board members nodded along, their attention drifting. This was routine. This was expected. What came next was neither. When Richard finished, Victoria stood. She thanked him for his report and then said she had an additional item to discuss, a matter of critical importance to the company's future. Her voice was calm, but I detected the steel beneath it. She had been preparing for this confrontation as long as I had. Victoria began by describing her concerns about the Henderson account. She spoke in general terms at first, noting irregularities that had been brought to her attention. Richard shifted in his seat. His smile remained fixed, but I noticed his jaw tighten. He interrupted to say that the Henderson account had been reviewed multiple times and found to be in full compliance. Victoria allowed him to finish, then continued as if he had not spoken. She introduced me as the analyst who had conducted the investigation. Richard's face reddened. He started to object, but Victoria cut him off. She said I had the floor and that interruptions would not be tolerated. The board members exchanged glances, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. I stood, walked to the front of the room, and began. I spoke for 45 minutes. I presented the shell companies, the offshore transfers, the suspicious transaction patterns. I showed the connections between Henderson's accounts and sanctioned foreign entities. I displayed Richard's signature on documents authorizing irregular procedures. I read excerpts from the encrypted emails, his own words condemning him. With each slide, each document, each piece of evidence, I watched the board members' expressions shift from skepticism to concern to alarm. Richard attempted to defend himself. He claimed the documents were fabricated. He accused me of having a personal vendetta. He called me aggressive and hostile, the same language he had used in that conference room 2 months ago. But this time the words rang hollow. The evidence was too overwhelming. His denials sounded desperate rather than convincing. Then Victoria delivered the final blow. She revealed that she had contacted federal investigators 3 weeks earlier, after reviewing my findings. The FBI had opened a formal inquiry. They had subpoenaed documents. They had interviewed witnesses. And they had confirmed that the patterns I identified constituted serious violations of federal law. Richard Whitmore III was not just guilty of racism and professional misconduct. He was facing potential criminal charges. The room erupted. Board members shouted questions. Richard's face went from red to white. He turned to the family loyalists on the board, the men who had protected him for years looking for support. He found none. When federal crimes enter the picture, tribal loyalty evaporates quickly. The board voted unanimously to suspend Richard pending the investigation's conclusion. He was escorted from the building by security, his protests echoing down the hallway. After the meeting, I stood at the window looking out at the city I had fought so hard to remain part of. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound exhaustion, and beneath it, something that might have been peace. The battle was not completely over. There would be legal proceedings, media attention, difficult questions. But the truth had been spoken in that room, and the truth had prevailed. Victoria found me there, still staring at the skyline. She stood beside me in silence for a long moment. Then she said 2 words that carried more weight than any speech. "Thank you." I turned to look at her. Her composure had finally cracked. I saw tears in her eyes, quickly blinked away. I saw the toll that this fight had taken on her as well. And I saw something else. Something that had been growing between us through all those secret meetings, all those shared risks, all those moments of connection. She asked if I would stay, not just at the company but here, with her, in this new chapter that was beginning. She spoke haltingly, uncertain for the first time since I had known her. She said she had never met anyone like me. She said my courage had inspired her to find her own. She said she did not know what the future held, but she knew she wanted to face it together. I took her hand. It was warm and trembling slightly. I told her that I had imagined this moment many times but had never believed it would happen. I told her that in all my years of fighting for dignity, I had never expected to find someone who truly saw me. Not my credentials or my accomplishments or the battles I had won, but me. The man behind all of it. The man who still believed, despite everything, in the possibility of justice and the power of truth. We left the building together that evening. The autumn air was crisp and clear. The city stretched around us, indifferent to our small victory but beautiful nonetheless. We walked without speaking, comfortable in the silence. There was much to discuss, much to plan, much to navigate, but there would be time for all of that. What mattered in that moment was the simple fact of being together. Two people who had fought through darkness and emerged into light. The months that followed brought changes I could not have predicted. The federal investigation resulted in multiple arrests, including Gerald Henderson himself. Whitmore Financial underwent a comprehensive restructuring, with Victoria implementing reforms that transformed the company's culture. I was promoted to Director of Compliance, a position that gave me the authority to ensure that what had happened to me would never happen to another employee. Richard Whitmore III pleaded guilty to multiple counts of money laundering and wire fraud. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. On the day of his sentencing, I did not attend the courthouse. I had no desire to witness his downfall in person. My vengeance had never been about his suffering. It had been about truth, about dignity, about proving that a black man in corporate America could fight the system and win. Victoria and I built something real in those months. Something that surprised both of us with its depth and strength. We took things slowly, aware of the complexities of our situation. A CEO and a director, a white woman and a black man. Each layer brought its own challenges, its own adjustments, its own moments of learning. But we faced them together, with the same determination we had brought to our fight against corruption. On a quiet evening in December, Victoria and I sat on the rooftop of her apartment building, watching the lights of the city below. She asked me what I had learned from everything that had happened. I thought for a long moment before answering. I told her that I had learned that dignity is not something you protect by staying silent. It is something you claim by speaking truth, even when the cost is high. I told her that I had learned that allies can come from unexpected places, and that judging people by their surface conceals the depths beneath. And I told her that I had learned that love, real love, is not about perfection or ease. It is about two people choosing to see each other clearly, with all their flaws and fears, and deciding that the seeing is worth the risk. Victoria took my hand. She said that meeting me had changed her life. She said I had taught her what courage looked like, what integrity demanded, and what it meant to stand for something larger than yourself. Then she said she loved me, simply and directly, the way she said everything that mattered. I told her I loved her too. The city sparkled below us, millions of lives unfolding in parallel, each one carrying its own burdens and hopes. I thought about my father, about his faith that dignity would triumph in the end. He had been right, though not in the way he imagined. Dignity did not triumph through patience alone, it triumphed through action, through courage, through the willingness to risk everything for truth. I thought about the young black man I had been 2 months ago, sitting in that darkened office, wondering if his career was over. I wished I could tell him that the road ahead would be hard but worth walking. I wished I could tell him that the pain he felt would transform into strength, and the isolation would give way to connection. But perhaps he already knew. Perhaps that was why he had opened his notebook and written those 3 words. Document everything. Truth matters. It still does. Victoria rested her head on my shoulder. The night was cold, but I felt warmth spreading through me. This was not the ending I had imagined when I first walked through the doors of Whitmore Financial. It was better. It was real. And it was just the beginning.